Thank you. This morning we're going to take a bit of time to give recognition to an extremely faithful soldier here at the Corps. We haven't had opportunity to do this yet, and Major Bill Travis, and I draw your attention to the screen.
Life well lived, celebration and tears, greeted in the heavenlies, embraced by the sun, new body glorified, untouched by the years, humble hands raised, the victory won. Promoted to glory, forever in His hands, clothed immortal. Welcome home, welcome home. The burden of our loss cannot destroy, the hope of heaven, His gift of joy, standing firm upon love's sacrifice, assured of tomorrow, forever with Christ, promoted to glory.
Isn't it wonderful that we can remember this man as one of God's own? We've had a death this past week with Commissioner Baxendale. And I find it interesting that he and Bill are now sitting side by side. Bill was quite a guy. And if you knew him like I knew him in at least the last couple of years of his life, well, you would know that he was a different man. But he was a man of God. Let me just give you a little background, and then Major Repass is going to come and tell you a little bit about personal life. Major Travis was born in Toronto, Canada on July 13, 1924, and was called to his eternal home on August 28, 2020. He was born of Salvationist parents. His father had been an officer in the 1890s, and then Corps Sergeant Major in Toronto, Canada for decades. Bill was active from infancy in the local Corps activities. Now, he served in the Canadian Air Force during World War II and worked in various factories after that where he met his future wife. They came to the USA Southern Territory in 1952 and applied for School for Officer Training, or the training college as was known in 1952. Vivian was reaccepted for officership and stationed in Athens, Georgia, while Bill was in training and commissioned in 1953 with the Herald's Session. On March 17, 1952, he wrote these words: I was converted at the age of 7 in a Holiness Meeting. My father had gone to the penitent form to rededicate his life to God, and I followed him there and was led to the Lord Jesus. I was saved, and from that time forward, I have had a desire to be in the will of God. There was a definite change in my life from that moment on. I never felt I was in God's total will for me until I had taken the step to become a Salvation Army officer. On June 1st, 1953, Bill was commissioned to Athens, Georgia, and was served there with his wife, Vivian. They served in 13 different appointments across the Southern Territory. And his beloved wife, Vivian, was promoted to glory on July 5th, 2003. After retirement, Bill worked in the shipping department at Atlanta Trade Department, and he worked also at Michael's for picture framing before moving to Top of the World. And lastly, I just say this. He became legendary here as a war cry distributor. I never had any war cries left over. Because Bill would say, I forgot that 2 weeks ago, anything that's left? And he was always there on the spot. He's also legendary for his ability as a handyman. Repairs of all kinds for comrades with physical limitations or those who don't have a clue of understanding the modern gadgetry. And Bill followed up the process. Quite a guy. In his last few years, he was lonely, but always happy. And he always kept his mind on what he was doing for the kingdom. And he just, as the poet John Greenleaf Whittier said, my eyes know not where the islands lift their fronded palms in air. I only know that I cannot drift beyond his love and care. Thank you, Bill, for all you gave to us and continue to give to us in memory.
My name is Larry Repass. I was one of Bill's long-term projects. In 1957, I was 16, member of the Key Club in high school, which was sponsored by Kiwanis. And the activities were Friday night we parked cars at the high school football games, and one Saturday in December we rang bells for the Salvation Army. I was on at 9 o'clock that morning at the kettle, and the boy who should have been there at 10 didn't show up, so I stayed. The boy who was supposed to be there at 11 didn't show up, so I stayed. And at noon, the Lieutenant Bill Travis came to relieve me, and we met and became friends. Now, this was 1957 Christmas time, and one of the things Bill said to me that morning was, come around and see us at the Salvation Army. I said, well, I'm very loyal to my church, and so I couldn't come to visit you on a Sunday or a Wednesday night. He said, that's fine, but come around and see us. We have an open air on Saturday night, and he mentioned that they were preparing for a tent revival with Major Carlton Butler. So I showed up at Saturday night open air and later to the several nights that week of revival. And I had, in the meantime, visited Bill and Vivian in their quarters. This is Princeton, West Virginia. I learned much later that Bill had said to his wife, do not speak to this young man about becoming a Salvationist because he's loyal to his church. And as far as I know, that was the only time Bill stood up to his wife. I'm serious. At least the 4 years I was with them, I don't think he ever did again. But I always appreciated that. Because in the activities I shared with them, I was enjoying it. And no one said anything to me about joining the Salvation Army until one Saturday night they had asked me to speak in the open air. And during that open air, God saw to it that I knew I should be a Salvation Army officer, and I never doubted it from that moment on. So I was enrolled in that summer, but in late August they got farewell orders from Princeton, West Virginia, down to Pulaski, Virginia, And they asked my mother if I could go with them in preparation for officership. I also later learned that it was because they knew the officer who was going to replace them in Princeton, and they weren't impressed that he would be good for me. And they thought maybe the Army would lose me. Okay. So I did go with them and live in the quarters on the building, which was typical in the 50s. And I was accepted as a Corps helper, and the pittance they paid me was turned back into the household expenses. I finished 1 year of high school and graduated and applied for training, but the DC, we used to call him the old warhorse, Bowders, Colonel Bowders. He said, "No, you're not a Salvationist yet. You don't know anything about the Army. You haven't worked in the world. Can't go this year." So we decided that I would go to Virginia Tech for a year. That was only 30 miles away, and if we commuted, the only expense would be tuition. And some families who had young men who wanted to go to Virginia Tech had bought an old school bus, and for a penny a mile, we could ride to the school and back every day. And so I became a student, and somewhere along the line that year, we decided, why don't you just go ahead and finish 4 years before you go to training? So I did. And Bill Travis personally paid the tuition for 3 years. I got a job in the summertime and the next summer as well, and helped a bit, but he mainly paid my tuition to graduate from Virginia Tech. And that last year they got moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, so when I came into training after that, it was from Charlottesville. Now, as I lived with them, Vivian would always say, anywhere we were, "This is my boy." And Bill would always say, "No, he is a good friend." And right to the end, that was Bill's response always. And he was a good friend. One of the things I especially liked about him was he took advantage of a Trade Department offer of Salvation Army books. And I think it was a lot less than half price. And he had a whole stack of them. And he did a project in the Corps to get the soldiers to read Salvation Army books. Well, I read them all. And some of them were very inspiring, very inspiring. Booth, the Beloved, gives a side of General Booth that I hadn't heard of before. Wonderful side. I guess I better not get into talking about the books, but I will mention The House of My Pilgrimage, where General Osborne in retirement wrote, being dedicated by the founder and becoming an officer in 1905, I think it was, and all the way to 1961 as a retired general. But he didn't talk about himself. He talked about the Army and the people that he had met along the way. Many of the great, great names of the Army, and also some of the unknowns who had influenced him. And that book alone made me a first-generation Salvationist, but a true, good Salvationist. I always credit that book. In fact, yesterday, my wife was going through some of the papers which Major Miller has turned over to us, and there was a letter from General Albert Osborne. "Thank you for reading my book." And he said some beautiful things. Well, I went to training, and after the first 3 years of officership, my wife and I were allowed to go to Bolivia on missionary service. I went to see Bill and Vivian before going, and after getting back to Atlanta, I got a call from him saying, "Larry, an accordion just came in. Do you want to take that to South America with you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'll put it on a Greyhound bus up to Atlanta." And he did, and it went with our personal effects. I didn't know how to play it, but it was an asset. So once we got the things out of the customs in Bolivia, about a year later, I sent a letter to then Captain Raymond Cooper asking him if he could give me some pointers about playing the accordion. And so he sent me a page explaining all those buttons, and it said something like, "Here's lesson 1 of the International Accordion course." And through all the 33 years we were out of the country, I was able to, I don't know whether I should say play it, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So where there was no music, I supplied something out of that. That was typical of Bill, to think about the work in that sense. After that, we of course saw Bill and Vivian only once every 4 years when we were home on furlough. And after retirement, 13 years ago, we were able to come down to Clearwater around New Year's to see Bill. And then at the Bible conference, he would drive up to our place, spend a night or two, and then we went on to Lake Junaluska. And on the way back, again, he was at our house for a day. He wouldn't stay longer than that. He wanted to get home. And every time we were together, we tried to coax him into coming to live with us. "No," he said, "Clearwater Core is my family." And he meant it, and he spoke so lovingly and often about you folks that we realized that was true. Well, just let me say one last thing. The old Welsh hymn had a name, if I'm pronouncing it right, Calon Lan, which means guileless heart. I'm going to put that on the gravestone where we're going to bury Bill's ashes in Westview Cemetery, for he truly was a man with a guileless heart. God bless.